So let's close out this chapter with a couple of more points. As you can see here, it's a very optimistic message. The tragedy is not inevitable. Tragedy of the commons is not inevitable. And we looked at one example from the past about how the open field systems were managed to avoid the tragedy. And Hardin came along and proposed that essentially shared resources or commons are going to be exploited, and he reads that let's read his word again. Therein is the tragedy. Each man is locked into a system that compels him to increase his herd without limit in a world that is limited. Ruin is the destination toward which all men rush, each pursuing his own best interest in a society that believes in the freedom of the commons. Freedom in a common brings ruin to all. And if you think about global warming, you think maybe he's right. But you can also look at what is happening under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement, and the fact that nearly all countries are engaged in negotiating as we speak. COP28 is going on, and they are making agreements on the process of loss and damage. So there is progress. Of course, I always point out that despite the 25 years of negotiations, the emissions are not still coming down, let alone slowing down. But there are some indications that we're heading towards peak emissions. Renewables are growing. Lots of solutions are being proposed, and we can also think of COVID-19 vaccine as an example of how we can come up with solutions when we are really pushed against the wall for survival. So it looks like we have gone down what Hardin suggests, that commons are destined for tragedies. So coming back to this book, the tragedy is not inevitable. Since Hardin's essay, an increasing awareness has emerged that tragedy is not the only possible outcome when people share a common resource. There are many examples of long-lasting communities that have maintained their shared resources effectively. Since the 1980s, there's been a steady increase in interdisciplinary efforts to debunk the simplistic view of the tragedy of the commons. Elinor Ostrom and others showed through comparative analysis of many case studies that communities can self-govern their shared resources or the commons. So this obviously takes lots of case studies, lots of hard work on the ground, and you cannot do it with satellite data alone and so on and so forth. So that's the beauty of the work of this social science, political science. Elinor Ostrom was actually, I think, a political scientist who went on to win the Nobel Prize for Economics, and there were a lot of nasty comments made about that as well. But the work is really, really relevant now, especially in the context of global warming and climate change and all the impacts we have had on shared resources and the commons, like the atmosphere and the ocean. So the outline of the book is this way. The book consists of 15 chapters. First few chapters discuss some basic concepts and frameworks such as institutions, which we'll do in the next chapter, action arenas, and social dilemmas. Social dilemmas are really important to understand human behaviors and how to manage them in the context of sustaining the commons. These concepts will provide the key theoretical foundation for analyzing problems related to the commons. In chapter 2, we define institutions, the rules and norms that structure human interactions. We'll understand the difference between the rules and norms. I think you have an intuition, but we'll do it more formally. This is a very broad concept, but we'll see that understanding the rules and the norms related to the use of the commons helps us understand how to sustain them. We will use the general terminology of institutions rather than of private property or markets, since those two examples are vague and imprecise definitions of clusters of possible institutional arrangements. The definition of institution matters. Without realizing, we are always in a institutional structures, whether it's one-on-one interaction and bartering or exchanges or buying and selling, or we are in a group context of buying and selling things, making things, and so on. The Institutional Analysis and Development Framework, IAD, that Elinor Ostrom established, that we will discuss in this book, provides a more general and accurate way of studying institutions and their performance, which is very important because you need metrics to track the triumph of the commons and the avoidance of the tragedy of the commons if we want to make this functional and effective and efficient, right? So the book, each chapter provides critical reflections and some questions that we must try to answer for ourselves as learning outcomes. So let's go through those in each chapter. Commons are natural and cultural resources that are shared by many people. People can affect the commons by harvesting from them and making contributions to their construction and or preservation. The core question this book attempts to address is how we can sustain the commons. Garrett Hardin, I said John Hardin, sorry, I think it's John Garrett Hardin. Garrett Hardin introduced the notion of the tragedy of the commons, which can occur if people share a resource with open access. The opportunistic behavior of individuals can lead to over-harvesting of the shared resource. Sorry. The only way to avoid the tragedy, according to Hardin, is to establish private property rights or tax the use of the commons. Okay, so this is kind of a capitalistic approach, even though there are examples of protecting trees in Kenya where people were told you own the tree, then they were protected, and there are also individual transferable quotas in fisheries that worked at least for some time. I don't know if that's still maintained. So it's not that tax and private property rights don't work, it's just that do they work in every context, every institution. And we'll look at the diversity of institutions in the next chapter as well. Elinor Ostrom and her colleagues show from case study analysis that overharvesting is not inevitable and that successful self-governance of the commons is possible. Think about that, right? Make yourself think also. Come up with commons you experience yourself. This is about the university you are in, the classroom you are in, the course you are taking, the dorm you are living in, the water tank, the water filter that you are sharing, the bathrooms you are sharing. Everything is a common, right? Shared. Are these commons functioning well? Think about that. Do your grandparents use different commons than you do? Now that you know, did your grandparents use different commons than you do? Now that you know about the commons, can you relate the idea of the commons to the budget discussions in Washington, D.C. or in your town, in your country, whatever? The book is written by the authors who live in the U.S. Marco is from the Netherlands, so I don't know where Andries is from, but nonetheless, you can apply these concepts to anywhere. In fact, a lot of Elinor Ostrom's work happened outside of the US. Okay, so let's keep that in mind as you move to the next chapter on defining institutions and thinking about how to analyze them and looking at the diversity of the institutions that we engage in without even realizing that that's an institution where we are working with implicit and explicit rules and norms. So we'll also define rules and norms and see how they work. Okay, see you in the next chapter.